I'm gonna show you how I made the Zippo lighter in Blender from start to finish. This is typically how you visualize real life products in Blender, and you can use that for advertising or something similar. So if you learn how to do this right, you can actually monetize your Blender skills and make some money. All the modeling tools and techniques that you're gonna see me use in this video, I'm putting them all in an ebook. You can pre-order that, I'll put the link below. We're gonna need two separate reference images for a project like this. We need one reference, which is gonna be like a blueprint. Ideally, this is just gonna be like a side orthographic projection picture, and we're gonna use this just for the dimensions and length and height and all this other shit. And we're going to need another image, which is not really like a blueprint or an orthographic projection side picture. It's just gonna be like a 3D picture from the side where you can see the depth, you can see kind of the proportions of the whole thing. Now, most of these lighter pictures, they have white backgrounds, so I'm just gonna go over here and paint net to adjust, invert colors, and that way I have a darker image. I don't have to deal with this brightness shit. It hurts the eyes when you're working. Now in Blender, I'm gonna go to side view, Shift A, image reference, and I'm going to load my blueprint reference image and place it in the background of my scene. Now when I go to side view, I can use this image to kind of tell me the dimensions of my lighter. When you're modeling an object which has some areas that have pretty high detail and other areas which have pretty low detail, in this case the top of the lighter is going to need a lot of polygons, a lot of geometry because of the holes and all this other stuff going on down here. But the bottom of the lighter and the casing of the lighter is pretty simple. When you have a situation like this, if you're trying to keep your topology clean, you always want to start with the area which has a lot of stuff going on, because that way when you're creating your mesh, you can make it very high poly and you can extrude everything else out of that. If you start by creating the low poly part, you're gonna have to add a lot of geometry afterwards, you're gonna have to subdivide shit, and that's very likely to give you trouble, so you always wanna avoid that if you can. I'm gonna start by making the top part here where you have this neck with the holes in it. When I do this, I'm also gonna try to follow the grid, just because that way I can snap stuff and it's gonna be a little bit more under control. I'm gonna use the default hue, I'm gonna lift it up by 1 meter, and in edit mode, I'm going to scale it by 2 on the y-axis. I'm also gonna take the face at the top and I'll move it up on the z-axis by another meter. Now delete the top and the bottom faces, obviously this is gonna be a hole, we don't need those, and add 3 loop cuts on both sides and 2 loop cuts that go around the entire object. You're also gonna need some loop cuts on these sides. Now this entire object is made of tiles which all have the same size. This is always good for your topology. You always wanna try to keep your models such that you always have the same kind of sizes for your faces. If everything is quads and all the quads have the same size, then you're good. So in this case, we're gonna subdivide this one more time, and later on we're going to add a subdivision surface modifier to this. But first I'm going to use Alt right click and Shift Alt right click to select all the sides and the corners of this mesh. I'm going to bevel those, and I'll press C so the bevel is limited by the next edges here. I'll push it all the way out and I'll scroll up once and then I'll click. This way it's kind of the same as if I just scale them inwards a little bit by making them round here. I did this because I just wanted to make these edges a little bit more round, but I don't want to have to manually scale them because they're going to be uneven. So if I just bevel them all the way, we don't add any new geometry, we just kind of reshape this corner here. Now select everything, go to mesh, merge by distance. You might want to use a shortcut for this because all the time you're going to have vertices which are in the same place. You don't want to have to visit this menu every single time. I use Shift W. And those of you guys who've been watching me for a long time, you already know I don't like to update Blender. I like to keep it old school. In Blender 4.0, when you press Shift S, you get a little menu where you have to pick what you want to do with the 3D cursor. Now it's not like this menu where you just kind of throw it in this direction and it's going to do whatever you want it to do, which is fast. You have to carefully select the right option, which is slow. I use the 3D cursor a lot. This shit gets on my nerves. This is why I don't want to use Blender 4.0. I just want to use Vanilla 3.6. I don't need the new features. I just need the old school modeling tools. I don't like it when they update Blender. So if you like using add-ons and all this fancy shit which people use to pretend like they're better at modeling than they are, you can go watch some other YouTubers. I keep it old school. I keep it fucking vanilla on this channel. Now here's why we subdivided this. We subdivided this object because now we have a bunch of geometry that we can use to create holes. And at the beginning, when I was adding loop cuts to this mesh, I very carefully and very intentionally added 3 loop cuts on each side and 2 loop cuts that go around here. This is because this gives me the exact amount of faces that I need to carefully place my holes the way that they're supposed to be placed here. Before we place the holes, I'm just quickly going to bevel these 2 edges in the front and the back, and I'll delete the faces here because there's supposed to be a kind of separation here. While you're at it, it will be useful to delete one side, go to object mode, and add a mirror modifier, because that way everything you do on this side is automatically going to be copied on the other side as well. Now if you're following along with this tutorial, make sure that your mesh looks exactly like mine. Make sure you have the exact same number of edges and faces on the top and the bottom and the sides and all this shit. Repeat exactly what I did. This is very important. And now we're gonna add the holes. Make sure that you add the holes to the exact faces that I'm about to select. For each hole, I'm going to use 4 faces. That way, when I inset it, it's gonna be an octagon, and later we're gonna subdivide this with a subdivision surface modifier. I'm gonna select one face, Control Shift, right click on another face. That way, Blender is gonna select the entire area bounded by these 2 diagonal corners. So I'm gonna select one face, Shift Control, right click on another face, and I'll do that to select these 4 faces at the bottom as well. Now I'm going to kind of create a checker pattern all over this object here. And if you look closely, you're going to see that this is exactly symmetrical on both sides. Again, this is very intentional, and this is exactly how the holes are supposed to be placed on this lighter. Now I'm going to press I to inset, and with my loop tools activated, and I'm going to use loop tools to turn this into a circle. If you don't have your loop tools add-on activated, you go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, type in loop, and just activate this box right here. It's gonna give you some more useful tools for modeling. I don't know why this is not there by default, but these are some very important tools in Blender. Once you have your loop tools active, make sure you still have all these faces selected. If you accidentally deselected all these faces, you don't have to manually select them all again. Just select 2 samples because these 2 are different sizes, so there's 2 types of faces here. Select 2 samples, press Shift G, and select similar area. Then just reduce the threshold to something like 0.000001, hit enter, and it's gonna select all the other faces which have exactly the same area as the faces which you selected. Then go to W, Loop Tools, Circle, and make sure you uncheck Flatten. This way the faces that you inset are going to be turned into circle, but the mesh is not bent at all, so the shading is not affected by this. Now we still have to make sure that we have constant sizes for these circles. If you notice, these circles are a little bit larger than the ones on the sides here. Now it's a lot harder to change the size of these circles in the corner, because if you just scale it up, you're gonna get some bending in the geometry because they're scaling towards the median point, which isn't exactly aligned with the geometry. You would have to place your 3D cursor exactly on this vertex in the corner, then set your pivot point to 3D cursor, then select the faces, then scale this up and down, which you would have to repeat for every single one of these faces. We don't want to do that. We can easily just select all the other holes here, which all have the same size. We don't have to scale those with the 3D cursor. We can just scale them with individual origins, and that way we can change them all at the same time and make sure that they have the same size as the circles on the sides. Now once all the circles have more or less the same size, I'll select all of them and just delete the faces. Now we have the holes. Currently they're a bit low poly. You can keep it this way, but I'm gonna subdivide this, and when we subdivide this, it's gonna look a lot better. And this is where shit gets tricky, because this is where you're gonna start creating the other parts of this object. And again, all of this stuff is connected, so you have to be very careful with your topology. Don't use any booleans on this. If you use booleans, you're gonna have a problem. I hate using booleans, and you guys are watching me for a long time. You know that I pretty much never ever use booleans. I fucking hate booleans. I just like to cut holes manually using clean topology like this. And don't go down in the comment section telling me, Aryan, you should do it this way. You suck at modeling. You should do it my way. Your modeling got you where you are. My modeling got me where I am. I make a good living off of this shit, so keep that shit to yourself. Now, I want to pull out another reference image so I can look at it here. I'm gonna use the other picture that I told you guys about before. I also don't like to use any external reference programs. Why the fuck would you download PureRef or whatever it's called when you can just load up references in Blender? I don't understand it, but anyway, there's this window in the corner of your Blender screen right here. This is called the outliner. This is where you have a list of stuff in your scene and you can control your file and all this other stuff. Let's be honest, it's almost never that you have to use this. I almost never use it. If I do have to use it, I'll just open it up, but I prefer to use my image editor in this corner over here, and that way I can open up an image and use it as a reference. So I can just pull up my Zippo picture, put it over here in the corner. I can zoom in, I can zoom out. I don't need anything else. Now I have a second monitor, so usually I just use my second monitor, but I want you guys to see what I'm looking at. I want you guys to be able to use references if you don't have a second monitor, and this is the same reason I don't use any paid add-ons. It's the same reason I don't use Substance. I just texture everything in Blender, because I don't want to teach you guys something that you gotta pay money for. You can do fucking anything in just Blender. You don't need anything else. In this case, I'm very lucky because I have one of these lighters right here next to me, so I can look at it very closely, and it's a much better reference if you have an object in real life. So here's what I'm looking at on my reference. Now, first of all, I'm going to pull some of these edges to the side, because this cut that separates these two parts, it gets wider as it gets closer to the bottom. So you're gonna have to move some of these vertices apart a little bit. It looks something like this in real life. Now I'm going to take these vertices from the bottom and I'm going to lift them up, and I'll take the corner vertex and I'll lift it up a little bit further. This way the faces stay perfectly flat, so the topology stays clean, but I can take these two edges and I can extrude out this little part, which holds this little thing which keeps the lid open. And obviously this is supposed to be smoother, and once we add a subdivision surface modifier, this is going to get a bit more round. So for now it's just going to be this way. This is the low poly version. Now I'm going to use my 3D cursor as a pivot point. I'll place my 3D cursor to this vertex right here. Then I'll extrude this edge here. I'll right click to snap it back into place, and I'll press S and Shift Y and scale it to 0. That way I'm scaling it down on the X-axis and the Z-axis at the same time. And I'll also use my 3D cursor to snap this shit over here to this corner. Now again, I'm gonna go to Mesh, Merge by Distance. I'm just gonna use my shortcut for this. And now I can take this entire edge loop from the side and push it lower a little bit further. And that way I'm going to make this slope continue down on this edge as well. I'm trying to do this without bending anything. There's no bending on any faces yet. Now I'm also going to take these vertices at the top here and slide them down one by one. And this way I can make this kind of slope downwards. And this is kind of what you can see in our blueprint from the side here. Now I need to push this a little bit further down, but I can't just push these vertices down like this. That's gonna bend my faces. So I have to select all the vertices around these faces, and I'll just push them downwards a little bit like this, and maybe I'll slide some of the vertices around here a little bit more. Now at this point I decided, you know what, I'll just push them down and I'll bend these faces. When we subdivide them, the bending is gonna go away. It's not gonna be a problem. So I'll place my 3D cursor at the vertex on top here, and when my 3D cursor is a pivot point, I'm going to scale this up on the Z-axis to push it down. Ignore this bending, we're gonna cover that shit up. The reason I'm doing this is so that it fits my blueprint like this, and then I'm just going to need some more geometry to do the same thing so it fits with this part of the blueprint as well. You might want to add another loop cut over here in the middle and scale that up as well so you follow this line down here at the bottom. At the bottom, I want this to be flat, so I'll scale these to 0 on the Z-axis so these two are aligned. Now we got enough geometry here to create this little semicircle right here, which holds this, whatever the fuck it is. I think it's a spring, which is used to keep the lid closed or to keep it open. I'll extrude these two edges up, and keep in mind, once we add a subdivision surface modifier, this is going to be round. So I'm gonna select this, press Ctrl 2 in object mode to add a subdivision surface modifier, and that way I can just align the vertices and watch these lines created by the subdivision surface modifier, and I'm going to align this with this little circle back here. I'm also gonna add a loop cut over here. That's gonna give me some more geometry and give me some more control over this shape. I also noticed on my lighter that these two should be a little bit closer together, and they should be completely flat on the X-axis. So it's gonna be something like this. Notice how none of the face bending makes any difference anymore once we add a subdivision surface modifier. Everything looks nice and clean, especially when you add smooth shading. I'm gonna go over here and make sure that this entire edge loop on the very end is completely straight, so I'll scale it to 0 on the Y-axis and maybe make some final adjustments in case I messed up the shape a little bit. This way we have a perfect shape, and later we're gonna add this little thing here. Now finally we have to start filling in this area over here. Now a real Zippo consists of two elements. It has the inside part, which we're modeling right now, and it has the casing. Those two can be separated. So the casing is what we're modeling at the moment right now, which means we should be able to just take these edges over here and extrude them down. If you want to, you're now going to use these edges to model the bottom part of this, but I don't want to model this. I just want to model the exterior, so I'm just going to model these together, and I'm not going to care what's inside of the casing. Again, this depends on what the purpose of your model is. It depends on what your goal is. I don't really care. I just want to make it look cool, so I'm going to pretend like there's nothing else inside here, and I'm going to pretend like this cannot be separated. If you want to tighten up these corners a little bit, you can just add a loop cut like this, and it's going to look a little bit sharper and a little bit better. Now you're going to need a loop cut over here because this part is going to have to be a little bit wider. So instead of just pushing everything on the X-axis, which is going to give me problems over here because it's not getting pushed out here, I'm going to select all these faces, and I'll use Alt-S, and I'll hold down Shift to just gently inflate it. This is going to push every face exactly in the direction of its normal line. If you don't know what a normal line is, Google it. Now I realize that I didn't have to do this because I'm going to have to delete these faces in the front. So we can just push this out on the X-axis. We don't have to use this Alt-S shit, but I just wanted to show you guys how that works. Now add another loop cut to tighten up this corner here, and then we're going to take this edge from the bottom and we're going to extrude it forwards. Inside view, you're going to see what I'm talking about. It's kind of difficult to see this on the blueprint, but I'm looking at it in real life, and just watch what I'm about to create, because what I'm about to create is exactly what this looks like in real life. So I'm going to push this further out all the way to the end here, and then I'll place my 3D cursor to the world origin, or more precisely, it should be placed at the middle of this object, exactly at the origin point, because that way when we use our 3D cursor as a pivot point, we can extrude this, right click and scale to 0 on the X-axis, and it's going to connect back here on this side. I'm going to take this edge on the corner and I'll press Ctrl B to bevel it. I want to make sure that this one edge is turned into 3 edges like this, okay? okay? Don't click yet, but once you have the right width, just press P and pull your mouse away. That's going to give it a nice right angle here. So doing this is basically the same as adding 2 loop cuts, one on each side, except you know that the distance between the edge and the corner is exactly the same on both sides. I'm also going to add another loop cut like this, because from side view, this kind of moves inwards. So if I push this a little bit further out, I can push these top vertices inwards. Now I'm going to add another loop cut over here to push this closer, and that way I'm going to have a slightly softer corner, and it's not going to be such a sharp turn over here. If we have a very sharp turn, the topology starts to look a little bit bad. Maybe there's going to be some bad shading or whatever. But if we add another loop cut, now we have some extra geometry, and Blender can create this smooth curve a little bit better. I'm also going to add another loop cut over here to make this corner a little bit tighter as well. I'm going to take these faces from the front and I'm going to push them forward a little bit because there's supposed to be a little bit of a curve here. Now there's only one more part that we have to add to this object before we can switch to full-on hard surface modeling, and we won't have to be this precise with the faces and the topology and all this other shit. That's going to be this part over here which holds the wheel that gives you the sparks when you turn it. I don't know what you call this shit. So to create that, I'm going to first of all have to create a much bigger gap on this side of the object. Now I don't really know how wide this is. I have no way to measure this. So I'll just bring it as close as possible without bringing it too close, and then I'm going to extrude this and pull it out. In side view, I'm going to take these 2 edges and I'll bring them out as far as I have to bring them. Then I'll take this vertex at the top and I'll slide it backwards as far as I can before it actually takes the exact same location as this vertex, because we don't want to merge those into one. Now I want to turn these 2 edges into a perfect straight line. So I'll go to W, Loop Tools, G Stretch, and I'll set the type to project. That way if the influence is set all the way to 100, these are turned into a perfectly straight line. These faces at the bottom I can delete because I don't need those, and I'll push this vertex out a little bit. I'm not going to perfectly align this with my blueprint because my proportions are slightly different, so I'm going to have to adjust my shape accordingly. And it looks like I'm going to have to slide these vertices up a little bit because otherwise my thing here is going to be way too big, but I have to make sure not to slide it too far up because then we're going to get some weird topology problem and we might get some twisting or shading artifacts or something. So I'll just bring it up a little bit before this angle here inverts. I'm also going to add another loop cut over here to create this tighter corner here, but be careful because now you have vertices which are very close together and this might get caught by your merge by distance tool. And since we're going to use a solidify modifier for this, you also might have some problems with that if you have corners or vertices which are very close together. So be very careful and keep an eye on this. Now this shape is more or less complete, and the only thing we still have to do with it is add some thickness. Right now it's just paper thin, which doesn't make any sense. There's 2 ways to do this in Blender, and to demonstrate this I'm first going to disable my subdivision surface modifier. The first way is to select all the geometry in edit mode, then press E to extrude, then right click and use Alt S and hold shift to add some solidity to this. This is going to push every face in the direction of its normal, and it's very useful for this type of stuff. When you do this, make sure you check even offset in this little menu down here. This is one way to add thickness to your objects, but in this case a solidify modifier is going to do the same thing. When you're using this modifier, make sure to check on these tight corners because you don't want to have any overlapping or any weird twisting on your edges. In this case it looks like everything is okay. So I can just bring back my subdivision surface modifier and everything looks nice and smooth. Now you might have to add some more loop cuts to control the shape a little bit better, because right now you have some very round and soft corners here, but this corner needs to be very sharp. So you might have to extrude this one more time and bring some extra geometry over here. I'm also going to add another loop cut over here because I want this entire edge here to be a little bit sharper. Once I apply my solidify modifier, I might even want to add another loop cut here that goes all the way around this object, because that's going to drastically change the way this looks. If you really want to go crazy, you can even add 2 or 3 loop cuts to this and remove the middle loop cut. This way you have a practically perfect shape. Now we have some fucked up twisting happening. This might just be because of our mirror modifier. It might be because there's some vertices in the same place. But it turns out that the main reason for this is that we have some faces over here on this side which separate these 2 parts here. So I'm going to delete all those faces. I'm going to remove the doubles or merge them by distance. And I'm also going to press Shift N to invert to normals to make sure that isn't the problem. The other thing that might be the problem is that these are not perfectly aligned with the y-axis. If you look at this from top view, you can see that this goes past the y-axis, which means that the mirror modifier is also going to mirror this to the other side, and they're not perfectly connected. So I'm going to select this entire edge loop, I'll place my 3D cursor exactly at the world origin, and I'll scale everything to 0 on the x-axis. Now all these vertices are going to connect perfectly, and we're no longer going to have this weird twisting problem. Now there has to be a floor over here. So I'm going to select this edge loop here. I'll duplicate these edges and I'll separate them to a new object. This way I'm going to keep the same curve that I have over here, so the shape is going to fit perfectly. I'm going to dissolve this extra vertex because I don't need that. And then this vertex is going to be extruded back until this corner here, at which point it's going to start going down so that it follows this curve here. I'm also going to extrude it and bring it to the middle by scaling to 0 on the x-axis. That way it's going to meet over here as well. And I'm going to add some extra vertices with loop cuts so that this shape is a little bit more under control and I can make it fit this curve a little bit better. Now we need to apply the mirror modifier, which you can do by hovering over the modifier and pressing Ctrl A. Make sure you merge all the vertices by distance, then go to face and click on grid fill. This is going to fill in this entire frame with perfect topology. You might have to adjust the span or the offset of this filling. Make sure that the span is set either to the number of edges that you have on this side, which in this case is 4, or the number of edges that you have on this side. Once you have that number, just adjust the offset and eventually you're going to get a perfect filling here. I'm also going to add a loop cut over here to make this corner a little bit tighter. Then we need to extrude everything down and delete the faces at the bottom because we don't need those. And we're going to select one of these sides, press Shift G and face angles. Then just set the threshold to something like 0.001 or 0.01. You don't want this to be too low. Then just select all the edges on the sides here, and we're going to bevel those just a little bit so that this is a little bit tighter and we don't have any bending which goes inwards here. Then we need to fix the normals because we have some visible shading issues, and now we have a floor for this object here. Now we're also going to have to add this type of plate thing which is placed here on the floor. This is where the fuse is coming out of. And there's no way you're going to see this on your reference, so I'm going to show you because this is what I'm looking at in real life. Go to top view, use a plane, make sure that it's exactly in the middle where the fuse is supposed to be. And we're going to extrude that, bring it backwards and scale it down as we take it backwards because it's supposed to fit perfectly between these two plates here which hold the spark wheel or whatever the fuck you call that thing. Now I'm going to add some subdivision to this and some extra loop cuts to the front and the back and the sides, and this is more or less the shape that I want to have here. Once I do that, I'm going to extrude it and I'm going to delete the floor, and again I'm going to bevel all the corners with a bevel that has a shape of 1, and that way it's going to be a little bit tighter. This is the part where people start calling me out for using a bunch of polygons, but I don't care, do whatever you want. You can use less polygons if you want to. Now it seems like this thing is kind of acting as a suspension or kind of like a spring which is supposed to push this thing upwards or keep it down or whatever. So this thing is very thin and it kind of moves upwards or something like that. Again, it's pretty hard to tell because we don't have a blueprint, but it's something sort of like this. It doesn't really matter too much because this detail is so hard to see anyway, so don't even worry about this too much. Now I'm going to go to side view. I'll place my 3D cursor in the middle of this circle. Shift A, give me a circle. I want to use something like 16 vertices. We're going to flip that to the side and scale it so it fits with the circle in the blueprint. This part is pretty easy. We're just going to fill it, extrude it out a little bit so it just sticks out of the side. And I'm going to add another loop cut to this shape here so that way this is going to be a bit more flat. Now I'm going to extrude this inwards and I'll delete the face that I have in the middle and I'll use grid fill instead. That way I don't have any weird endons and I don't have to deal with any weird shading issues or anything like that. I'll add another loop cut around this, then I'll select the vertex in the middle, and with Ctrl+ I'll select this entire area including the set of faces that goes around here, and I'll push that outwards on the x-axis by just a little bit, and I'll bevel this part a little bit as well. This way, when I added smooth shading and at one level of subdivision, I can delete the back face and this is going to look pretty nice and smooth. Now I'm going to place the origin of this object onto the world origin, and that way when I'm going to use my mirror modifier, it's going to be duplicated exactly on the other side. So I'll place my 3D cursor here, object, set origin, origin to 3D cursor. I also have a shortcut for this, which is Ctrl-Shift-Alt-C, which is what the default shortcut was in the old version of Blender. I don't know what it is now or if they even have a shortcut for this. But you can set your own shortcuts. So you can go to Object, Set Origin, and just right click on this and just assign shortcut and just press any button and it's going to be set to that shortcut. Now I'm going to add a mirror modifier and we're good to go. We can use this same object in the front here, so I'm just going to duplicate it, but I am going to have to make it a little bit larger. And when you scale it up, make sure that you scale it up in edit mode, because that way your origin is going to stay in the same place. You're not going to mess up the scale or anything like that. I'm going to show you a really cool trick for making this wheel here, because you can see that it has some weird pattern, some weird surface. This would take you about 6 million vertices, so I'll show you a special trick to do that without adding 6 million vertices. But we're going to get to that later. For now, we're just going to take care of the easy stuff before we get to the fun part. So we need this little shape back here. It's hard to see it in the blueprint because it's covered up by this lid here, but I can see it in real life, so you're gonna just watch what I'm doing. Place your 3D cursor somewhere over here, add in a plane and rotate it sideways so that it's facing you. Now scale this plane down and rotate it by approximately 45 degrees. You're gonna bring this vertex down a little bit. You're gonna pull this one a little bit more this way, and we're gonna slide this one back up here. Now we're gonna extrude this edge. We're gonna bring this vertex up, then we're gonna extrude it a little bit further, bring this one up, and extrude that a couple of times until you get more or less to the bottom of this lid here. At the end here, you're gonna have to take an edge and lift it up quite a bit because the shape gets a bit larger over here. Obviously, we're going to subdivide this to make it nice and smooth, and we're gonna add another loop cut or two in the middle so we get a little bit more control over the edges. This is more or less what this shape looks like. I don't know if it's 100% accurate, but does it really matter? Probably not. So let's bring this exactly to the middle, and one way to do that is to snap the 3D cursor to the world origin, go up here to options and check locations. That way when your 3D cursor is a pivot point, you can scale this to 0 on the x-axis, and it's going to move exactly here without changing the scale of the object. So we can uncheck this and also add a mirror modifier to this. Now we're going to extrude it to the side and bring it out here. Delete all the faces on the inside, and now they're going to connect, so you can also add a loop cut this way. It's going to be very good if we also select this entire surface on the side and we inset that a little bit. Now add your smooth shading, you can go ahead and apply your mirror modifier, and you're going to be good to go. Next, let's go over here and add this circle. We're going to have to add this circle so it's exactly in the middle of these two circles. We can make our lives easier here by applying the mirror modifier, selecting everything in edit mode, pressing Shift S cursor to selected. Now the 3D cursor is going to snap exactly in the middle of these two objects. We can also set the origin point to this location. Now that our 3D cursor is placed over here, we just have to go to side view and add a circle. The circle is going to have a pretty nice amount of vertices, so I'm going to set it to something like 64. I'm going to flip this to the side so that it's facing me. I'll make it a little bit bigger and I'll fill it. Now again, I'm going to add a mirror modifier to this, so that way when I extrude it to one side, it's also going to be extruded to the other side, and we just have to delete the face in the middle. And I am going to add a loop cut here as well. That way when I add some smooth shading, this part is going to be nice and smooth, but I'm going to bevel this as well, so that way the shading is also under control on this shape here. Correct your normals and you're good to go. In a minute, we're going to add these details to make this shit look crisp. Now let's go ahead and add this little thing down here. This should be pretty simple because this is just going to be a bit of a cylinder. So I'll place my 3D cursor in the middle of this wheel here, Shift A, circle, give me 32 vertices for this. I'm going to bring this all the way down to the floor, and now I'm just going to look at my reference and kind of do what I see here. So I'm going to fill it in, extrude it once, then extrude it inwards and scale it up and bring it up a little bit, then extrude it up one more time. Now we have the base of this thing here. Now I'm going to inset this a little bit, but we're going to have to make a bit of a separation between this ring at the base here and this other cylinder over here. So I'll extrude it down, extrude it inwards one more time, and it's going to look like there's a bit of a separation there. Now this base here needs to be a lot bigger than we created it because I can see that in my blueprint. So I'll just lift everything up a little bit, and this cylinder I'll lift it up a bit more. Then I'll bring it up, extrude it out one more time, scale it down to make this bevel here, and finally we're going to extrude everything inwards one more time. And again, we're going to make a sort of separation here, so I can just duplicate this circle and extrude it up one more time. Finally, let's move on to the casing. This is the best part. It's not the best part, but it might be the easiest. The casing is gonna have to be made from the geometry of this base of this object, because this is supposed to fit into the case perfectly. So I'm going to take this edge loop and I'll separate that into a new object. And of course, I'm also going to scale it to 0 on the z-axis. And it might be helpful to remove some of this extra geometry and extra vertices that you don't need here. Just make sure you don't remove too many, because then you might affect the corners. This is because we still do have a subdivision surface modifier on this. Now we're going to extrude this down, and we're going to check from a side view how far down we have to push this. It's going to be approximately this far. Once you do that, make sure you correct the normals. Now this is where things get interesting. We're going to have to fill in the base here, but we can't just press F to fill it, because that's going to create a horrible n-gon, and as you can see, that doesn't work with a subdivision surface modifier. So instead, we're going to apply the mirror modifier, then we're going to merge all the vertices by distance, invert to normals, and all this other stuff. And once again, we're going to go to face and grid fill. This is an example of what happens when Blender doesn't recognize the default settings for the grid fill, and you're going to have to do them manually. In this case, we're going to have to set them to 4, and then we're going to have to change the offset a little bit until it fits better. So for me, span 4 and offset 2 works best. Now we're going to take all the faces at the bottom, we're going to extrude them and we're going to bring them inwards a little bit. This way we get an extra loop of edges over here which can be used to control this corner. And this will be the equivalent of adding a bevel here, so we're also going to add a loop cut up here. We don't want to bring these too close because we still want this to be kind of round. At the bottom of the Zippo, it kind of goes inwards like this, so you can extrude it and bring it up a little bit. Now the lid is going to be basically the same as the casing at the bottom, so we're going to have to go to side view, we're going to duplicate all this, and we're going to rotate it, and we're going to scale it to -1 on the z-axis. This way it's just going to get inverted so it's flipped the other way. I'm going to align it with the edge loop at the top here, but I'm going to separate this to new object so I don't merge something by accident. Now the only difference here is that the top part has a little bit of a different shape from the bottom. So we can delete all the faces at the top, and we're also going to have to get a slightly curved shape at the top here. So we're also going to delete the vertices. Then we're going to select 2 edges at the top of this at the very ends, and I'm going to use my proportional editing with a sharp fall off. This way I can go to side view and I can move these down on the y-axis, and they're going to pull everything around them, and we're going to get a kind of curved shape at the top. Once we've done that, disable your proportional editing, and once again use your face grid fill at the top here. Now of course we're going to have that in a loop cut, but I don't think we have to inset anything because this looks pretty good, so let's just go ahead and add some smooth shading. Now the only thing missing from our casing here is the thickness. So we're going to select both of these objects in object mode, then we're going to hit edit mode, and now we're simultaneously editing both of these meshes. So I'm going to select everything, I'll hit extrude, right click and Alt S to push this outwards a little bit and make sure to check even offset. Obviously the subdivision surface modifier is going to play its part here, so I'm going to select all these edges here and I'm going to bevel those with a bevel that has a shape of 1. This way we're going to make this sharper, and I even want to add an extra loop cut up and down to make sure that everything is tight. I also want to have this little hinge here. I'm going to place my 3D cursor on the corner here on the part which is exactly in between the top and the bottom parts of the casing. I'm even going to place the origin for both parts of the casing to this point, because that way I can easily rotate them around this point. I'm going to open up the lid and rotate it by some 95 degrees or something like that. And this is also the exact area where we need to add our hinge. So I'm going to add a cylinder with like 32 vertices. In side view, we're going to make it face us so we can also tell how big this is supposed to be. I think it looks absolutely enormous in this reference, so I'm going to make it a little bit smaller than that because I don't like how this looks. Then I'll add a loop cut in the middle and I'll bevel that. This way I can make a separation between the outside and the inside of this hinge. So I can take these 2 face loops and extrude them inwards a little bit to make it look like there's a gap there. You might even want to delete those faces on the inside. Now I'm going to take the faces in the front and the back, I'm going to inset those and give me a subdivision surface modifier, smooth shading, and I'm also going to bevel all of these faces. If you really want to be cool, you can even take these faces at the ends and extrude them inwards, and then you have to inset them again. This is going to make your mesh look a lot cooler. I'm also going to do something else. I'm going to hover my mouse over the inside part of this hinge and I'm going to press L to select the entire loose part. Then I'm going to separate that to a new object, and this is supposed to be connected to the bottom, so I can just join those 2 into the same object, and I can join this into the same object as the top part of the lid. Now we have a beautiful little hinge so we can close this thing or open it whenever we want to. On the inside of the Zippo we have a wick. I'm going to show you 2000 IQ trick, which is what we're going to use to make this wick, and this is probably what you're going to use anytime you're making rope or some other shit. First of all, let's go to top view. Place your 3D cursor somewhere over here, add any mesh. I'm going to just add a plane, go to edit mode, press X, and click collapse edges and faces. This is going to turn your face into just a single vertex. Now we're going to move this vertex a little bit away from the 3D cursor, and I'm going to press Alt E. I'm going to click on spin, I'll check use duplicates, and I'll set the number of steps to something like 8. Now I've got 8 vertices which are arranged in a circle. You might want to merge by distance at this point because you probably have 2 vertices in one place. Now we're going to go to object mode and we're going to add a screw modifier. In the screw modifier, set the screw value to something which is going to make it look like this is all coiled in a rope or something. Because a wick is basically just a rope, but it's dipped in lighter fluid, so that way when you set that shit on fire, it's gonna burn. Now apply this screw modifier and go to the object menu, go to convert, and convert to curve. Now it's not a mesh anymore, it's a curve. This is the same type of curve that you would use when you're using an array modifier and you want to make a chain, or you want to make tank tracks, or you want to make your mesh follow this curve. But we're not going to do that, we're going to do something way better. So go back to object mode, go to this little tab down here where you have this little green curve. It's called object data properties. Scroll down and find the menu that's called geometry and find the bevel segment. Now you just want to increase the depth a little bit because this is going to make your curves have some solidity to them. You want to make sure that you can't see between these individual strands, so make sure it's a little bit too big. Then go back to edit mode and take each of these ends of each curve here and just extrude them out and make them kind of shoot in some random direction. This is going to make the top of your wick look a little bit more messed up and a bit more natural. It would also be wise to reduce the resolution because otherwise you're gonna have way too many polygons. Then we're going to go back to the object menu, go back to convert, and now convert it into a mesh. So now we can individually edit every single edge and vertex and face that's involved in this situation right here. So now I'm going to select every circle which is at the end of every one of these tubes, and with the pivot point set to individual origins, I'm going to scale these down a little bit and I'm going to fill in each face. Now I'll just go to object, shade auto smooth, and you might want to increase the value to something like 45. It would also probably be a good idea to use your proportional editing with smooth fall off to kind of make this look a little bit twisted or bent or something like that. You want to make it look natural. Now just make this nice and tiny and place it exactly in the middle of this lighter so it's exactly where the wick is supposed to be placed. Now it seems like I'm only gonna have to download one material from the internet. So I'm gonna go to textures.com, go to library, and you're gonna find a PBR material section. I'm looking for something which is like a scratched metal. This is what the casing is gonna be made out of. And you got a whole bunch of materials over here, but if you scroll down far enough, you're gonna get to a section which is called metal. And I already had a look at these before, so you don't have to watch me browsing through these and making up my mind as to which one I'm gonna have to choose. And I'm gonna go with polished bronze. Don't look at the color doesn't matter, we can easily change that. But we're gonna download the albedo, we're gonna download the normal map, we're gonna download the roughness map, and we're gonna download the metallic map. Now switch over to the shading tab in Blender and add a new material to your casing. In the new material, you're just going to drag and drop these images that you just downloaded, and we're going to plug those images into the appropriate plug. So the albedo has to be plugged into the base color, the metallic map has to be plugged into the metallic value, make sure you set that to non-color, the roughness map needs to be plugged into the roughness input, also make sure to set that to non-color, and the normal map is going to be a little bit different because we have to run it through a normal map node. So go ahead and add a normal map node, place that in between the normal map image and the principal BSDF node, set the color space to non-color, plug the color into color, plug the normal into normal, and you're good to go. We're going to apply the same material to the top part of the casing, and I already UV unwrapped this model off camera. I don't want to show you that because I don't want to make this UV mapping tutorial. If you want to learn how to UV unwrap stuff, then just type in Aryan UV unwrapping tutorial Blender or some shit. It's gonna come up. I don't feel like putting the link in the description. I also don't really like this texture, so I'm gonna get rid of the albedo map. Maybe I'll make the base color a little bit darker, or maybe I'll make it just a little bit blue. This way it looks a little bit nicer. I don't really like my roughness map. I feel like it's a little bit too intense. So I'm going to go ahead and add a bright contrast node in between the roughness map image texture and the principal BSDF node. Then I'll just reduce the contrast value to make this a little bit less obvious. You can also reduce the brightness because this is going to make the whole image darker, which means if the roughness map is darker, it has a lower value, which means lower roughness value, which means more shiny. I'm also going to apply the same material to this little spring here, but for the inside part of this slider, I'm going to add a new material, and this is just going to be a very basic metallic, low roughness kind of thing, which makes it look like it's chrome. The scratch thing is also going to be added to these little screws over here, which hold everything together, as well as this little part down here, except for the little thing which makes the actual spark. We're going to create a new material for that. We're going to assign that to this mesh, and this is just going to be like a dark gray object because that's what this is supposed to look like. And now we're gonna get to what I believe is the most important part of this entire video. We're going to create this kind of knurling pattern on the outside of the spark wheel, and we're going to bake that as a normal map, which we're going to apply to this cylinder. That way this is gonna look like it has a bunch of detail, but it's not actually gonna have any detail on it. Go to top view, add a new plane, and push it to the side while holding down control so it snaps to the grid. Now press K to activate your knife tool, and hold shift and click on each of one of these edges so that you create a diamond kind of shape. Then delete all the vertices from the corners and scale this up by 2 on the x-axis. Now this is very easy to tile if you hold down control, that's why we did this with the knife tool. Now add an array modifier to this and set the count to something like 5 or 6. Apply the array modifier, then in edit mode duplicate this once but hold down control so that they're perfectly tiled. Then add another array modifier and uncheck relative offset, instead check constant offset. Set the x distance to 0 but set the y distance to something like 1, maybe 2, depending on what works best. In this case, it looks like 2 is gonna work best. Now just crank that shit up a little bit, and this is the pattern that we're going to use on our wheel. So we're probably gonna need something more like 50 on the count. Now make sure you merge by distance, correct to normals and all that. Then go to face, extrude individual faces, right click, set the pivot point to individual origins, scale each face down and just push it inwards like this. You might even want to scale the inner faces to 0. Now again, remove the doubles because now we have entire faces compressed into just a single vertex. Apply the array modifier, merge by distance one more time, then bevel everything just slightly, but make sure you have 2 segments in a shape of 1. Now you can just go ahead and add smooth shading, and this pattern is going to look pretty good. So now we have to bake this into normal map. To bake this in the normal map, place your 3D cursor on this origin point right here, add a plane, and go to top view. We're gonna have to place this plane exactly in the middle of this pattern, and in this case we have to scale this by a power of 3 for it to be perfectly seamless, so we're just gonna scale it by 9 and hit enter. This plane has to be just slightly above this surface. Now go to the viewport overlays menu and check face orientation. Make sure everything is blue because all the normals have to be facing upwards. If something is red, just select all that geometry, press Shift N, and check the normals over here to make sure everything is blue. Now in the shading tab, add a new material to the plane and just name that normal map or something like that. Then add a new image texture node, and this is where we're going to bake this normal map. Generate a new image, set the resolution to something like 1024 or 1024, that's fine. You also want to name this into something that you're going to recognize, so probably knurling pattern normal map is going to work best. Make sure the generated type is blank and check 32-bit float and hit OK. The color space has to be non-color, and now we're going to select the pattern, then we're going to shift select the plane. Make sure that you're in cycles render for this. Set the samples to something very low like 1 and scroll down to bake. Set the bake type to normal and check selected to active. This is going to bake from the selected object, which is the orange pattern, to the active object, which is the plane here. You can also view your image as you're baking over here. Make sure that your image texture node is selected and just hit bake and wait a couple minutes until it bakes. And now we've got our beautiful normal map baked right here, which you have to save as an image to your computer. Now we can delete this, or you can just push it to the side in case you're gonna have to use it again afterwards. And now we're gonna apply this normal map to our wheel. So make sure you apply any modifiers because you don't want to have any modifiers while you're doing this. And there's a few very important seams that we have to mark here. First of all, select the edges that go around the circles on the sides of this wheel and mark those as seams. Then select one edge loop that goes across this cylinder and mark that as a seam as well. Now go to Hue, Unwrap, add a new material, set the color to some gray shit, and we're going to add a new image texture node into which we're going to load up our knurling normal map. That's obviously got to be non-color, and we're going to run that shit through a normal map node so that it loads as a normal map. Once we plug that into the normal input, we're going to see something going on with the wheel, but obviously we have to map this a little bit better. So now we got to go to UV editing, we're going to deselect everything, and we're going to go to face select mode, and with L we're going to only select the sides of this cylinder. Now we can look at this UV map right here, which we're going to have to scale way up to make sure that it looks about right. You also want to pay attention to the seam that you marked because you want to make sure that your texture meets here properly. And now we have some absolutely beautiful knurling on this texture. You might want to duplicate this material over here and assign the duplicated version to the sides of this cylinder because you want to remove the normal map from that. We don't want to have the knurling visible on the sides. Tell me that isn't one of the coolest things you've seen all fucking day. And now your lighter is ready to go. Now you might be sitting there completely blown away by how do I know all this shit about Blender? How do I know about all these tools? I've been doing this for 10 years and I'm putting everything that I know about modeling in Blender into an ebook, so you can pre-order that. I'll put the link in the description below. Like the video, hit subscribe, leave a comment below, and I'll see you guys in the next one.